Hello, everyone. We were waiting just for our last panelist and amazing Dr. Megid. He's just late a couple of minutes, but he will be joining us. So I will start introducing our panelist still is here, as he's already the host for our webinar. So welcome. This is our fourth webinar, and we'll be very excited to discuss a very interesting topic that is taking place nowadays around us, which is, will education go back to the way it was, or is it forever changed? And we'll be very happy to actually hear some of the opinions you have as our audience. And we'll also be happy to see all your questions and get them in the last, in the end of our webinar. So as a start, let's see our panelists. So we have Dr. Megid. He's going to be our host of the webinar, and he's the director of iHub here in Egypt. He's very known in everything related to whenever you say entrepreneurship in Egypt and helping startups. He's just there helping everyone without waiting for anything. He's really amazing person and well known in the ecosystem, and he loves to work with young entrepreneurs and help them. So he's here today to talk to you about education and and take it from there. And of course, he will be having a very interesting series of questions for all of us and for you to hear about. Our next panelist, I'm happy to talk to, of course, Shamima. We are having her from Dubai here today. And thank you, Shamima, for joining us. She is the co-founder and CEO of EduTech. So I'll actually prefer that I leave Shamima and Alden to introduce themselves and tell us more about what they are doing. So I'll only say their names and then I'll give the mic for them to introduce themselves. And the last, so Alden, the last but not least, Alden, he's a senior fellow, and he's coming to us today from Duke University in the US. Welcome, Alden. I'm very excited to talk to you today. And you are, so for me, Alden is really representing the professors and university side of you, while Shamima is giving us like the perspective of industry. She's been working with education and technology platforms and solutions and working with clients like universities, schools. So it's amazing to hear from different perspectives. And of course, Dr. Megid will also give us insights from the entrepreneurship and side of the industry as an edtech as well. So please, Shamima and Alden, if you can introduce yourselves and then we can take it forward.
Alden, why did you go first? Alphabetical order.
Well, alphabetical by first name, I guess, Shamima. If by last name, I would go second, but that's fine. Thank you very much. My name is Alden Zeka, and as Khadija has said, I'm a senior fellow at the Fuqua School of Business at Duke University in the United States. I have been with Duke University now in different roles, but since 2015. The business school is where my affiliation is, and I'm not currently this term a lecturer, but I have been a lecturer in the past, and I work with the Center for the Advancement of Social Entrepreneurship there, and have done a fair amount of research on e-learning and learning tools and education in general as part of my work. And I'm very excited to be here today joining this esteemed panel to kind of share my opinions and thoughts from the perspective of someone who has been a lecturer. And even back in 2015 already, I was doing some of my lectures online, which I know some of my colleagues at the time thought was very unusual. But I can explain when we get into the panel as to why I thought it was good, and I think very beneficial for the students I had to go online early on. Let me now toss it to Shamima to introduce herself.
Thank you, Alden, and thank you, Khadija. So yes, my name is Shamima Parveen. I am the co-founder and CEO of EduTech, Middle East and in India. So I've had the privilege of working with educationists for the past 30 years. And with a lot of innovators in this field who are implementing technology for the purpose of transforming education. And that is really where my passion lies. And like also at Alden, I'm also involved quite a lot in entrepreneurial involvement, specifically women entrepreneurs, empowering them to become more entrepreneurial in nature and cover path in life, and hence my relationship with Khadija as well. And I look forward to our interactions and sharing my experiences, views, and thoughts, and answering to your questions as well. So look forward to a great conversation today.
Dr. Maged is here. So Dr. Maged, I did a quick intro for everyone till you're here. And of course, we'd love to hear about yourself as well. And then I'll leave it to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Khadija. My name is Maged Ghanima. I'm a professor in Ain Shams University. And throughout my years, I have worked in the industry. I've worked in NVIDIA, in Intel, started off my path maybe in research inside academia, went after that to the industry, as I said, and then I went back again to academia, but this time I was trying to work more to bring in the aspects of innovation and entrepreneurship back into Egyptian academia. And this is where we created the Innovation Hub, the iHub, that started off as a small center in the Faculty of Engineering in Ain Shams University. And now, after 8 years, it is in 44 different locations across 26 different universities in Egypt that served, I think, more than 60,000 beneficiaries across the different 8 years. Penetrated multiple different market sectors, and I'm very, very happy and proud of many of the startups, such as Braksieelabs, for instance, that we're seeing growing year after year, and looking forward to see more players in the edutech segment and across different other market sectors. And hopefully during this panel, which I'm very, very pleased to be hosting, and with our panelists coming in, we're talking about the governmental sector, or we're talking about the industry, the private sector. So right now, as we go along, I'd like to maybe start this panel right now. And as you know, the webinar will be recorded. And so we'd like you to be engaging more with us, asking different questions as you go along in the Q&A box. And hopefully the recorded webinar will be sent to you. There will also be a schedule. There will also be an opportunity for you if you want to schedule a demo for Braksieelabs. I think the link is right in front of us, and you can also go ahead and create a free account on it, on that second link that you see, and hopefully you can look at the different experiments that are available that you can check out from that third link. But most importantly today maybe is, how can all of this be beneficial? How did it all start? Where are we right now? And where are we heading? I think this is what we want to learn more about all of this today in this panel. And of course, as I said, and I'm again saying it, please, if you have any questions, if you have any comments that you would like to participate with, it will be great to have them so that we can address them as we go along. So maybe let me start off with the first question that I have, so that we can all recap and understand what has been going on. EduTech is not new. Educational technologies has been there for years. So we might wonder, many people would be wondering right now, what kind of technologies existed before the pandemic, before COVID-19 era? What were they? How were these technologies being used? And maybe I'd like to give the floor to Alden to give us his perspective from the academia point of view. Alden, let us know.
Oh, thank you very much, Dr. Maged. From my perspective, as I said in my self-introduction, I've been using educational technology since 2015 when I was lecturing at the Duke University Business School, was when I first started using some of the technologies. And, we were using a learning management system for students to track deadlines and due dates on assignments and to turn them in electronically. We were also already using recorded lectures so that students, if they could not attend a lecture when it was live, could watch it, or if they attended it live, they could go back and watch it and remind themselves of some of the materials. Of course, we were using email to distribute materials, but also sharing in cloud storage folders, assignments, cases, materials, things of that sort. And the particular course I was teaching was actually involving international projects. And for obvious cost reasons, the students would travel sometimes, but many times not travel internationally because of the cost and the timing. And so we were already using video conferencing technologies. Obviously, they're not as sophisticated as they are now. They were much more basic, but we were already using video calls at times selectively in the coursework. I think the biggest use of technology that I was taking advantage of, which I think at the time was a bit, let's call it evolutionary, maybe not revolutionary, was the fact that I was in some cases pre-recording my lectures and telling students that they had to watch them before the class so that the class time was used exclusively for Q&A and discussion, and that there was no lecture actually given during the course. And I know that many of my colleagues who were teaching felt that this would, A, they felt it would not be successful, and B, they thought it would actually ultimately lead to not needing professors anymore, or at least to the same degree. By the way, both of those were wrong. I think it was very successful. Students actually liked it. And there's been no reduction in the number of staff, teachers, or professors. So no one's lost their job because of it. So I think those are some examples before the pandemic of what was going on.
That's great. And I think many of these are things that are taking place right now. Many people are using that. And I think maybe it gave out to new teaching methodologies, and they have different names right now, like flipped classrooms and blended learning, and many of these terminologies that people might be listening to and hearing for the first time. But as you said, these technologies existed. Maybe they were just being used on a very smaller scale. Maybe there were many skepticists, but once the pandemic hit us, people had no other choice but to go ahead and train them. So of course, there are people that are pioneers like you using them. Others came to use them after that and maybe came up and innovated more in how they were using it. But again, it was great to listen to your perspective as an academic. Let's listen right now to Shamima. I would like to listen to her perspective coming in from the industry. What kind of technologies did you see existed before the pandemic, and how did you see them being used?
Sure. So not to give out my age, but the first learning management system as such that I helped implement was in 2001 in a university here in the UAE. So the perspective that university came from was that, I think, like I believe, and they also believe, that students don't like to be taught, they want to learn. So I think with the purpose of using technology to engage with the students while they are in classroom, much like what Alden said, but also giving them the responsibility for the learning rather than spoon feeding them with teaching while they are in a classroom, making them more self-learners, which is what is required now to be lifelong learners as such. And that is really what propelled myself and my organization to be in the area of education technology and implementing technologies that are more standardized right now, like a learning management system, or like what you mentioned about Alden, like video recording, what is called a lecture capture system. But what also is the perspective that to be able to use these technologies is that it's also able to capture best practices. We don't get the same level of teachers in every institution and in every year in an institution as well. So having a lecture capture kind of an environment provides the university being able to capture the best of the teaching abilities and to use that as a model in many ways for many of the other teachers too. So thereby having a level of consistency availability also. And then obviously the technologies were huge, broad in terms of usage. Then came the online testing assessment platform, where students wanted to be able to have an opportunity to do formative as well as summative tests online, freed up a lot of the teachers' time in being able to provide feedback as well as grades immediately, but also a lot of data that came out of this, all of these systems, to see how students learned and how can we make learning better. To me, that is really the whole purpose of what all of these technologies are. And that is really what I strive to see whenever we introduce or even recommend a technology, if that would make teaching and learning better in any institution. And that's really what I think is beginning to happen right now, I'm glad to say.
That's great. And I probably want to pick up from here. And once the pandemic hit us, the technologies already existed, or at least many of them. How did people start using these technologies in a different way? What were the changes in the use of edutech, of educational technologies? So maybe you can continue commenting on this, please, Shamima.
Sure. So I think when the pandemic hit us, as a human race, we did rose to the challenge. And I think teachers took on a lot of those responsibilities. So kudos to them. It was a very difficult environment in which all of the teachers found themselves in, whether it is in a K-12 environment or in a higher education. And I think everybody did their best. The only difference was the ones who were doing okay did better. The ones who were struggling performed worse because they didn't prepare. Nobody prepared for the pandemic as such, none of us did, but they were not prepared for the changing education landscape in which changes were already afoot. We were in the midst of a digital transformation in the real world, but some places in education that had not yet happened. And that is what they had to really adapt towards, that they needed Zoom to communicate in meetings, but also to be able to teach. And by the time a large part of the population in the world was shopping online, we were communicating online, we were calling for taxis online, digital was driving our lives, and we were also beginning to rely more on data to make decisions. So some parts of the education struggled quite a lot. And yes, many of the universities had like a learning management system and many of the other technologies, but they were not strategic in nature. They were tools that were bolted on top of existing infrastructure or pedagogical practices. So they were not really being utilized in this kind of an environment that required this to be the primary method of teaching and learning. So that was the biggest adaptation that teachers had to adapt towards. But I think we prevailed, and we learned while being put into that situation, and we did transform in the pressure of the situation.
Great, great. No, that's great insights. Alden, what do you think? What kind of changes have you seen across the US universities that sort of complements and adds to what Shamima just shared with us?
Sure. I think we've seen a few changes. Of course, much more rapid acceleration of adoption of these technologies, as we would expect, right? Because everything moved online. I think for many of the faculty, it was actually a very nice opportunity from, of course, instigated by an outside source, but a nice opportunity to re-examine both the content of what they were teaching in addition to how they were teaching it. I think most people think about the how, right? Using technology, doing it online, so on and so forth, all of which I agree with Shamima, that it was going from being a tool to a core part of the strategy, right? So from an ancillary tool to a core part strategy. But I also think in many cases, faculty looked at changing their content to determine what was really the important part of each course and what was maybe more peripheral or more adjunct or supplementary, not necessarily eliminating the supplementary parts, but putting it in a different format, putting it maybe only as a recorded material or putting it as supplemental downloadable PowerPoints or PDFs and things of that sort. So I think it was a tremendous opportunity there. Unfortunately, I think there were also some negative changes. For example, saw an increase in students honestly cheating, copying work from one student to another, copying and plagiarizing work that was already published online that they could then download, copy, reformat, and submit. And so there's been a little bit of an arms race, if you will, in technologies to block cheating and to solve that. And there are several solutions now that are showing up there. I think another area was in regard to certain training, certain teaching really requires hands-on aspects, right? And so, for example, there's a company that I did some research work and talked with. They're based in Chile, in Latin America. And they came up with a solution to teach surgeons in medical school how to do certain types of surgery purely online. And people say, oh, that's crazy. Like, why aren't they working on people? They should experiment on people. But obviously, because of the lockdowns, it was not possible for them to do that. So they actually developed a system to teach, and let me be clear, very specific types of surgery, not every surgery, in an online format, and have demonstrated, in fact, through academic research now in a controlled study, that those students learned faster, learned better, learned more in a shorter period of time. So I think there are several of those changes that will stay with us long term. It's not just because of the pandemic. I think even once the lockdowns are removed around the world, we've recognized that some of these changes have very positive long-term effects.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you for sharing this with us. And maybe I'm sure most of you are looking at the different questions that are being posed out, and maybe two of the questions really rang a bell. And from them, I'd like to pose a question to Khadija. As a technology provider, providing certain technologies that really help out in these times. Some people say that, does that mean that traditional teaching skills are no longer important, given that they're not using technologies, new educational technologies? Others are saying that, well, is it only about using the technology, or is it also about pushing people to be active learners? So from your point of view, Khadija, in Praxilabs, how do you see the requests for the tools and the usage of the tools inside the curriculums change as the pandemic hit us?
Thank you, Dr. Megan, for the question. And as I agree, of course, with much of what Shamima and Alden were saying. And I think from my perspective, it would be like an evidence to what they were saying about the pandemic and about, at the very beginning, struggling, like universities and professors, everyone was not ready, and they were like running around and trying to find the best alternative suddenly. And the ones that were ready, as Shamima said, they didn't have any problem. So for us in Praxilabs, we've already seen two different points of view. University that were ready just came to us directly because they knew about virtual labs. They knew that there is something called virtual labs that can help them in the lockdown. So once the lockdown happened, they just found the alternative, which is finding virtual labs to help students continue practicing and continue uninterrupted. And that's when they came and say, okay, now we can use the solution. And actually, even themselves, even after knowing that virtual labs existed before the lockdown, they didn't think of trying it. And the reason is, it's all about resistance, mentality change. They want someone to convince them that you don't need a lockdown to really see the benefits. Even as a complementary to real labs, you don't have to steal a lockdown. You can use the virtual labs as a complementary to increase the students' performance, to increase their learning outcomes, a lot of benefits that when universities, I don't want to say like they had to, but they really had to suddenly use them. They saw all the benefits and they learned themselves that why were we just thinking or assuming a lot of negatives or assuming certain things? They were, for example, some of them thought that it would be a very difficult adoption for professors or students, but that was completely the opposite. Like I was once saying that a lot of universities, not only in the US and the UK and even in the MENA region, our emerging markets, we had universities using the platform in just one day. They were ready and had their students continuing their education in one day on the platform, and they did not need to do any orientation, because we're talking teenagers that know everything about technology. They don't really need orientation to use something that looks very similar to an educational game, but it gives them the outcomes that they need for practicing real labs. But just it's not replacing real labs. I need to say that, of course, but it's giving almost, we can say 60 to 80% increase in retention and learning outcomes till you are able to go to the real lab and do the final trial. So it's, I think we've been seeing a huge increase in our requests from everywhere in the world. We've been benefiting more people, and I'm happy that this happened, although of course some unfortunate reasons for that.
Well, I think there's a reason for everything and there's a start for everything. So I'm glad to see this happening. But also, I wanted to trigger another question, which was the pandemic hit us. We had some technologies that were out there. Not everybody was using it. But all of a sudden, we were locked down in our houses. People were not allowed to go on campuses. Education had to continue on, and we needed to do this online. So people had to embrace and use these technologies, whether the existing ones that happened before the pandemic or even the newer ones that got modified as we went along, from complete lockdown to semi-lockdown to blended learning and all those different models. So we have multiple stakeholders in this educational system, whether we're talking about students, whether we're talking about faculty members, even we're talking about administration staff. Did all of them really welcome these changes? Did all of them really had the right ability and the right infrastructure to use all of this? What kind of difficulties did some of them face? As you know, ages, of course, are some ages are, I would say, are really happy to use technology. They are early adopters. Others are not. So, Alden, from what you've seen inside the US universities, who do you see welcome these changes and who did not?
Yeah, great question. I think the students welcome the changes the most. I think faculty, it was largely correlated with age. The younger faculty were very welcoming and adapting very quickly. And then the older you got with a faculty, the less it was welcomed. I think faculty that were, let's say, just broadly near retirement age, were probably the least excited and the least welcoming of this. I know some colleagues who are older and, as I said, near that retirement age, where they basically struggled with the technology in the beginning. And accommodations were made. I mean, I have the luxury of working at a well-funded, large institution, and we had the luxury of being able to, within government guidelines, send support staff to people's homes to help them set up home systems in some cases. Access to infrastructure is obviously a challenge. Some people live in or are in situations where they don't have broadband access. They don't have access to high-speed internet. Here in the US, the government has actually just recently, within the last month, passed a law that will subsidize broadband internet access for certain low-income geographies, certain parts of our country, which are on average lower income. So those are all been changes. But I think that I think now, though, people have changed. People have come around. I think the majority, not everyone, but the majority of faculty and definitely the vast majority of students are very adept at the situation and have adapted and are comfortable with it. And in fact, I would say for the majority of students that I've talked with, prefer it. And I don't mean exclusively online, let me be clear, but having online options, whether that's a hybrid option, a blended option, or so on and so forth. But I think that the majority of students want to retain some aspect of online going forward. And I actually think many of the faculty do as well. And I think the administrations have now seen that given the students like it and are learning, and in fact, there was a study by the Research Institute of America that showed that retention rates are increased by online learning versus in person in many cases. So it's not just equal, in fact, it's enhanced. I think that is going to lead, or has led, and school administrations to adopt this and embrace it. And I know that a number of schools are now looking at long-term contracts with ed tech providers to keep offering these services 3 years out, 5 years out, well past what we anticipate to be the pandemic impacts.
Great, thank you very much, Alden. I think we've seen, or we've heard right now from Alden what he thinks, how these changes have been welcomed in the US. Shamima, given that you are in the MENA region, did you see the same things over here in the MENA region? I've seen some of the questions that some of the audience are asking. I think one of the audience is from Pakistan, another one is from Mexico, another one from Algeria, all saying that many of the students or faculty might not have that same infrastructure in countries like the US. So of course there were other difficulties. Did they really welcome the change in the same way that Alden said? What do you think, Shamima?
Oh, I think one thing that this pandemic exposed is the inequalities that does exist in our society. Unfortunately, it does. So inequalities is not just in terms of access to technology, with Alden talked about. That is true, because even in what you would consider a much more developed country within the MENA region, the initial investments was about getting laptops into the homes of students, because remember, not every student had a laptop. Maybe the family had one laptop. Now the mom was working and the father was working, and so were 2 or 3 kids, and everybody had to access maybe with 1 or 2 laptops. So that was a difficult decision as to who would get priority as well. So it was a lot of these factors that had to be addressed, and also the space. That was another big factor, and that's something that I've experienced myself. When we went into lockdown, many of my colleagues, we just had to get used to kids jumping around and going in the background, and there is a lot of household noises, as you can say. It just became a part of the learning and the work atmosphere as such. And that is also a challenge for many people, because we are not used to working and learning in that way. And in fact, noise is a big impediment to focusing and concentration. So that became a huge, big inequality as well, whereas some people had access to maybe a separate room, many didn't. So that it was a challenge in many of the countries and in many of the homes. So access to technology is one aspect, but also I think, remember, the other challenge was some of them were sick. So being able to take care of one's health, and not just physical health, but the mental health issue was also another big factor that came in. And again, some had better access to medical care and some didn't. So the inequalities was not just in terms of access to technologies, but were just so varied. And so what it really brought forth is that we had to address many of these issues along with the education. And like what Alden said, we are not going to go back to normal as such. And I don't want to use the word new normal because we don't know what that is, but a changed future in which we have to probably adjust to all of these new realities that is going to exist, and provide access to everybody. I don't know how, I don't have a solution for that. It's a very big question. It's it's beyond my pay scale, as they call it. It's a government level question to address that, but that is the reality, yes. So it was a bit challenging for many of the countries that you mentioned, and across the world, in fact.
Great. But again, Shamima, with the lockdown that happened, and many of the universities still want to provide their premium services to their students, to their learners. They had the option of going completely online, completely giving theoretical and maybe some of the problem-solving workshops or classes that they do online. And in such a case, there were many challenges of providing hands-on implementation, such as working in labs. There were some of the technology that existed or even evolved during the pandemic solved that. I've also seen other tools. A lot of people have really lacked their social life, and we've seen the emergence of many, I would say, new alterations to social networks that sort of helped students to intermingle. Some people were under pressure, and we've seen a lot of different psychotherapy solutions that help reduce such pressures. So yes, there were tons of challenges, but I can see a lot of companies like Braksylabs and others have stepped in to solve these challenges. Can you identify some of these challenges that students have seen, faculty have seen, and administration have seen, and maybe some of the solutions that came out to solve such challenges?
Excellent question, Maged. Yes, education is just not theoretical, like you say. Yes, you can impart information, you can watch videos, you can have a number, all of that is a part of learning. But some programs like STEM education, for example, or in engineering requires practical learning experience. And that is where something like what Khadija does in the Praxilabs, like virtual laboratories, come into place. And that is something that we implemented also with many of our customers over here. And some of them went at I would say, a beginner level kind of an introduction, because remember, many institutions and even ourselves didn't know how long this was going to last. So it was whether this investment is required for a long-term basis or whether we can just do with a short-term solution. So many short-term solutions institution came up with teachers recording a lab experiment and making it available to students. It was the best possible option at that point in time. And then came virtual labs, which was obviously at the top end, but then also there were solutions like creating kits and sending it to students' homes so they can do some hands-on experiments as well, using very simple materials that are use and throw kind of material. But it is better than not having access to any hands-on material, specifically in the area of STEM education. So that was certainly a requirement. But I would say that something like a virtual laboratory is not necessarily only for a pandemic kind of a situation, because what we have learned is in a STEM education environment, the more access students have to practical learning opportunities, the more they feel confident in taking that up as a career and going on to pursuing higher education in the STEM fields. So students don't get enough access time in laboratories, whether it is a science lab or a very expensive analytical labs or a medical lab. So these kind of solutions gives them the opportunity to be able to learn, to practice, and to let go of the fear of using these equipments as well. Because many of the time, they see safety posters and they're given warnings on what not to touch. And so they are actually already in a very tense situation when they go into a lab environment. So giving them a more exposure makes them comfortable, makes them aware of safety and health aspects of it. So when they do go into a lab, which we all hope that they do in the very near future, they do get to do real experiments and see real situations. But I also say that also in a lot of physics kind of experiments cannot be done in a real lab. What if scenarios. Students always want to experiment with a what if scenario. So if I do this experiment in the moon where the gravity is less, what could happen is something that a student always have a question on, but you're not going to let them do that in a real lab if something happens. So these are the opportunities. So these opens up, what we say, it's about having the curiosity of the mind that is much more important. So these solutions opens up the curiosity of the students and make them wonder. We want kids now to be able to wonder of new ideas. So this is what I think gives them the opportunities to do that.
Yeah, I'd love to build off that.
Great.
Sorry. I completely agree that wonder and that curiosity is so critical. And I absolutely agree with Shamima that there are several types of experiments where online is by far the best approach because of safety or because of costs. There are certain experiments where the reagents, the materials that you use in the experiment are hundreds, if not thousands of USD. Well, you can't do that very often then. I mean, it's impractical. But if it's virtual and you can do it and reset and do it again and reset and do it again, effectively at near zero cost or very low cost, that's a wonderful opportunity. So I think it's appropriate as a supplemental tool for certain things. And then, as Shamima said, there are certain things where we want students to do it live, in person, in the laboratory, obviously where it is safe, healthy, and cost effective.
But let me take that.
We've lost Dr. Magan.
Yeah, I think
Unfortunately, his internet must have gotten bad.
I can take the mic here for a minute. Yeah, I wanted to comment on what you were saying because I mean, the last question Dr. Magda was asking is about the challenges and what are the challenges facing students or faculties or administrators at universities. So one of the things that we faced with universities, and it was not a shock, but it was unexpected for us to see that this is very similar in the MENA region and in Africa and in Asia and in the US. I mean, it's all around the world the same thing, which at the very beginning, whatever happened at the universities, and although they understood that there is a need, they didn't have the budget for it at all. I mean, it's not that they had and they don't want to pay. Like we say here about schools, they don't want to pay. No, they actually didn't have the budget. Like they said, we really want to, but let me think, how can I take a budget for another item, another perspective, and put it towards the digital solution? They had it for the real labs. They had a lot of budget for real labs, but suddenly they didn't have the same budget for anything. And that it was just very frustrating to them that we had, I think someone, we had that actually pay themselves for their students and pay the subscription themselves. And others, what they did is they asked their students if they can afford it, they can even pay for themselves. So we had sometimes students paying for themselves, professors paying for their students, plus university. So it was kind of, I guess, this was a very big challenge. And now we are seeing that it's getting much better because universities, they know the challenge, they know that it's going to be here for some time. So they started preparing and putting budget aside, even if it's not a big budget, because I know they have a lot of items to pay for, as Shanima said, and as Alden said, there's learning management systems, there's virtual labs, there's Zoom for education, etc., etc. So it's a lot of things. But again, you are cutting off some other budgets. Like you don't have any administrative things, administrative costs at the university. You don't have expenses, for example, like, I don't know, lighting, things inside the real labs. These costs, you can use them for the digital solutions. So I think this is a lesson we learned together with our customers, and we learned how to kind of manipulate the system to find the budget to be able to get the platform and let the students benefit from it. Dr. Megan, we just answered the question right after you're here.
Yeah, sorry I got disconnected, but again, one of the things that I really saw is that it's great to see many companies stepping in to avail their educational technologies. And maybe in B2B to universities and schools and so on. But there are many other universities and schools that did not have the ability or capacity or opportunity to integrate technologies. And that's the companies. And I think this was one of the questions for one people from the audience, they were asking, is what is the role of the companies themselves in availing such technologies to students that do not have the capacity to maybe pay, or maybe that belong to universities or study in universities that did not have the capacity or the ability to create such technologies. I've seen maybe companies like براكسيلابس availing some of their experiments so that students can still go ahead and integrate and interact and so on. So maybe you can tell us more about that.
I could answer that because this is something that we did. I mean, as soon as the pandemic hit, everybody was hit. And so, like you said, many of the institutions were not ready for it. And I think everybody came together to support in this kind of a situation. I haven't seen, in my experience, a very common acknowledgement of the situation, and everyone literally I knew opened up their technologies, their softwares, their solutions to schools free of charge. I mean, no questions asked. And we did the same for a lot of our coding platforms that we offer called Tinker. And many schools utilize that to teach coding for kids online. and many of the science experiments that we provided as fully online, and also platforms for teaching and learning online, and video recordings, lecture capture systems. So this is something that just not us as EduTech, as an organization, but across the world, people did come in. And even larger organizations donated many of the hardware necessary as well for kids to have at home, because many kids didn't have laptops at home or tablets or iPads at home. So there was a many number of donations that were done for students to have access to these kind of technologies as well. But in this kind of a situation, it was just not a matter of one company or a person. It was like everybody had to do their bit. And I think it's something that I witnessed myself personally.
Great, great. No, thank you very much for sharing that. And maybe I want to jump to another question. If we targeted students, and I went and I asked a large population of students, and I gave them this question, and I would ask them about if they noticed any benefits from remote learning. Was there any practices that they would have hoped their professors or their teachers or their school would retain after this pandemic is over? And maybe I would also add a couple of questions also that the audience have asked. Some of the students have also noticed, or maybe this is something that we can look into, active learning skills and active learning methodologies. We've seen some professors adding this into their pedagogical approach throughout the pandemic. Do you think the students have really touched upon that? Do you think that they would really want that to continue? I mean, it's a set of questions, and maybe I'd like to ask Alden, what do you think the students would reply to that? I know that you said that students, we've seen that a number of students cheating have increased. Maybe that's why they like remote learning, but let me hear from you. What do you think?
Sure. I think that overall, and again, I'm going to generalize, it's not going to be 100% of the students. You'll never find 100% of the people agreeing on anything, let's be honest, right? But I think overall students like having the option for remote education. The key question is, in my opinion, should it be a blended model, some remote, some live, or should it be at least an option to have 100% remote? Right? And again, I'm not saying forced, because you can have the blended option of you choose. Today I have a lecture, you choose to come, or you choose to watch the live, or you can choose to watch a video recording, right? This is up to you. I think people like choice, first of all, in just in life in general, we like choice, right? Why not? If it doesn't cost me anything more, sure, I'd rather have options. But I do think that because it caters to different students, and I think there was a comment in the Q&A earlier about this, right? Some students prefer learning online. Some students prefer learning in person. I understand that. We're all different. And some students prefer learning certain topics online, but other topics in person. Again, you know, we're all humans. We're going to differ. So I think that having those options is what students are loving and would like to retain. I also think that they'd like to have the flexibility of, this week I will attend in person, next week I will attend online, and by the way, when I attend in a recorded session, maybe it's because I'm on holiday with my family. And that's okay if they're still learning the material. I do think it's going to result in changes to how we test, how we administer examinations, how we look at reports, because we have to accommodate students learning in different ways, and each student taking a different pathway to the same endpoint, as well as potentially at different speeds, right? So we have to think about that. My opinion is we will see more and more short courses, or what I would call modules, rather than full-term courses. I think we're going to see a lot of content broken down into 1 week long modules. And students will then have to take maybe 10 modules to complete the equivalent of a course today and get that credit. But instead of saying that you have to take, 4, 5, 6 courses a term, which means maybe 10 a year, I think you're going to end up taking maybe 100 of these 1 week long segments throughout the year in order to equivalent. But I think that's the way we're moving. And I think students are embracing that and liking it. I think the limitation is the speed with which the institutions and the faculty can offer that. I think that's the bigger limitation. I don't think it's the students' demand. I think it's our ability to deliver what they want.
Great. And Shamima, you have a lot of clients and you've interacted a lot with the students that are studying and so on, especially those coming in from our region over here. What do you think? How do you think they will answer this?
Well, I think what Alden said is really right, because the world is changing, not just in the US, all across. And I think I think you know, Maged, that in the Middle East, we have a huge amount of youth population in the demographics. And so I think all the governments are really focusing on job preparedness in the future. And one of the things is that, like what we keep saying, that we are teaching students for jobs that don't exist right now. So these 4-year degree programs as such are very much questionable, because by the time they graduate, the need in the market has changed. And I'm not throwing words around, but the fourth industrial revolution as such has brought about dynamic changes on an everyday basis that we, like what Alden said, we want to be able to provide students with short, what are called micro credentials that are stackable. So they would do a course, have a micro credential and stack it up, and they would then be having a certificate or a diploma or a degree that is something that makes them job ready. And also remember that universities are actually having competition right now, because it's no more that the students need to go to an university to get these. Companies like Amazon and Google are beginning to offer job-prepared courses that are going to give these students a much better opportunity in getting a job than a 4-year degree program that a university offers. So there is no other option for universities to be able to have status quo, because I think one thing is the future is blended, it is dynamic, and we just need to be prepared for it, and the students are going to ask for it. The market and the youth population are going to ask for that kind of education.
Great. Okay, Khadija, as a technology provider, as providing the Praxilabs, and you've interacted with a lot of students, how do you think they would answer?
Okay, I think I'm trying to find the things that are extra to what Shamima and Olin said, because I think they said a lot of the very important points. But one of the things that I myself have seen with students, because I mean, I teach at the university, I have all my colleagues are academics, and I also work, I mean, I see them in my work. So the thing is, suddenly we found students talking about, I mean, like Shamima was saying, students suddenly have independence. They have time management and decision-making authority. They didn't have that before. In the traditional setting in schools and universities, they are not forced, but they have to follow certain paths. They have to follow certain schedule, timings, everything. Now students learned new skills. They learn how to do a lot of, actually, I think it might not be working for everyone, but for a lot of them, they liked it. They prefer to do their own schedules. They prefer to learn at their own pace. Some of them don't really have the same processing, I wouldn't say processing power, but they are not learning in the same pace as their colleagues. And that's why I think it was also very useful for students with the learning, I wouldn't say disabilities, but difficulties. Like these were the students that talked a lot of times about they were sometimes shy to ask or shy to be felt, to be left behind. And that's why it was very, I'd say, not interesting, but it was very useful for them to learn online and learn in a remote way. But also some of the comments we've heard from students. So one of the things we love to do is try to get feedback of students directly. So rather than just talking to the professors, we try to ask the students themselves in workshop or any certain way. And a lot of them answered the same exact words, which is, now we have what is learn anywhere, anytime. These are the two words they are now learning. We can learn anywhere and anytime. So I don't have to be in the lab in the morning. I don't have to be in this specific time. I might be, as we said, sick, or I don't want to learn in this specific way. So now they have the platform open for them 24/7, and from anywhere they are, even if they are on their vacation, they can learn. And yeah, I mean, overall, I think they were very excited about the possibility. And I'm honest about that. They said that they cannot do that all the time without real labs. They must have it complementary to real labs, unless, of course, in the future, and that's what we are hoping for, we are adding more technologies like haptic feedback, etc. And that's then we can even give them the senses and I wouldn't say replace real labs, but hopefully would do that.
Given that I'm looking at the clock right now and we got 5 minutes for this webinar, I'll pose my last question, and maybe this will be the closing question for each of you that you probably can give us maybe a 1 to 2 minute answer. We've all been taken, COVID-19 took us by a storm. It was all sudden, and everybody had to quickly come up with solutions so that things can continue. Nobody had enough time to prepare, but now that we have been through this pandemic, and now that we saw that there are many other options, and we can see that the digital transformation of the educational sector that we've all dreamed of, whatever we expected to happen in the next 15 years has actually happened in the past 15 months. But we do have enough time to plan for whatever is coming in right now. So what do you think is going to be the future of educational technologies now that we have more time to think, more time to avail resources? So what do you guys think? Shamima, looking into the MENA region and looking at how things have evolved, what do you think, how do you think educational technologies are going to evolve, not just as the technologies, but even the need for these technologies in the MENA region?
Yeah, thanks, Majid. Yeah, like you said, there's going to be maybe more such events. Climate change is something that for us to be aware of. So we do need to be prepared and not taken aback again. That doesn't bode well for us, right? So this is an opportunity for us to, it's actually an opportunity for us to come up with a more long-term, long-lasting changes in education. But I wouldn't want to just focus on technology actually, but I want to just focus on education, because technology is only a tool, and I've never really liked the term e-learning because there was a focus so much on the E rather than on the learning. But I think the technologies are meant to be able to aid the learning process. But what I would really like to see is that this is our opportunity to see how we can really understand how teaching and learning works for students, for different kinds of students, at different kind of situations and environments with different levels of equity, and be able to create an education that works for the future, which is, again, we're not going to be able to predict it. Have a less of an emphasis on assessments, on the traditional assessments as such. And I think we are already seeing that being to go away. An example is SAT. Nobody thought SAT is going to be not considered to be able to get a college admission, but it's not. So then why do we need an examination to be able to assess students? And like what Khatija also referred to earlier on, the concept of time and space as such. The summer holidays was actually something that was created for the purpose of having people available. We don't pick cotton anymore. We are in the fourth industrial era as currently. So we need more dynamic education systems and time and spaces where, again, like anytime, anywhere is a great term, but truly to be able for students at all levels of technology access and education access and good teacher access as well. Because again, we have a very big shortage coming up of that. A lot of teachers are burnt out right now. And if we don't take care of them, we are going to have a huge shortage coming up in that. And that's something that we need to be able to take care of. So I would think that this is a watershed moment for us to relook at our education itself in all the cases and prepare us for that's the only way to prepare for the future that's unknown. That's what I would say.
Awesome. And Alden, from your point of view, and Alden, from your point of view, how do you see professors, the teaching staff? How do you think what's going to change in the future from what they will provide to improve the learner's experience?
Yeah,
what do you think
we're
coming here?
Yeah, I think we're going to see several changes from a faculty perspective. I think one is we're going to see the volume of information that faculty offer to students significantly increase. But as Shamima said, I think that the way we might assess whether a student has learned it or not will radically change. So for example, one of the things that I was experimenting with a few years ago, pre-pandemic, was basically offering about 1.5x the amount of content in a course than a normal course, but allowing students to choose which of those modules they wanted to absorb. So the offering, the volume of offering is going up. The amount of total amount of student is required or asked to absorb is about the same, right? And I think as faculty, what does that mean? It means a lot of investment of time on our part to develop that additional content, to develop those initial modules. But because of technology, like recorded lectures, like recorded systems and others, it does not mean that we have to keep investing 1.5x all the time. We can do that once or twice and then leverage that and just update selectively the modules that we think need to be updated based on changes in society, changes in learning, changes in research, things of that sort. So I think that's a big change for faculty. I think that what that is going to mean is, in my opinion, I think we're going to see a generational shift in who is faculty. I think you're going to see there's going to be something, and I don't know exactly where, but I would say something probably, at least in the United States, maybe mid 50s, late 50s and up. You're going to see a massive shift to retire early or to retire quickly. And I think you're going to see a new a crop of faculty coming in who are currently in their late 20s or early 30s, just finishing their PhDs, just finishing their research, who will be coming in, and there'll be a big change in the demographics of who the faculty are. And they'll need to keep up with those changes over time. So I think those are some of the changes that I anticipate seeing coming on board.
That's great. So given what we heard right now, Khadija, as a technology provider, how do you think that as we evolve from here, how do you think that companies like Braksylabs are going to evolve in terms of the technologies, tools, and services they provide, so that they can cater to these changes that Alden and Shamima just said?
Yeah, that's a very nice question. So some of this we've already started doing. So actually, rather than only trying to talk to universities by ourselves or dealing with university one by one of the things that we were thinking of a lot and now is taking place is actually because everyone needs access to this, and it's going to be more in the future, and we are sure that it's not going to be like backward, it's just progressing. We are now focusing on the partnerships. There are lots of tutoring systems now, there are lots of platforms for content, publishers, content, tutoring, as I was saying. So all these online platforms, rather than just focusing on ourselves, we want to put our labs inside all of these platforms to just enable everyone in the world to have access for it, rather than just depending on us and coming to us, as opposed to every single country has their own known content provider that they are related to or trusting, so they can access this in a better way. So really it's more about scaling and scalability. And of course, in the technology side, we are thinking a lot about, again, inclusive, opening it and enabling for everyone. That's why a lot of our plans is going forward towards, so for example, now we don't have an app or a native app, and that's why we have to have it, especially to cater for less ages or the teenagers, for example, or to have the accessibility, because it's very, very important to allow students with disabilities to have all the same rights that we all have. So working on all these kinds of projects, I think we are trying to scale both markets and also technology and platform, and I'm sure every other company in edtech needs to take advantage of what's happening. It's not something good, but it's in our favor, and we need to embrace these changes and benefits.
That's great. Given that we're over time, but I wanted to say that I think it was a very great panel. I'd like to thank all of our viewers that have tuned in and have enriched us with a lot of different comments, with a lot of different questions that I tried as much as possible through our great panelists to answer them. But I think COVID-19 created a lot of miseries that
I think there's a connection problem, and Dr.
We may have lost Dr. Magid again.
Yes. Okay, but I did the photograph just right at the time. So
yeah, but I wanted to take some extra minutes from yourself, Shamima and Alden, to answer some of the questions we have in here. We answered most of them during the discussion, but I'll just tell you quickly some of the ones that are here now. So one of the questions is, okay, so in Colombia, someone is asking about Colombia. In Colombia, the government spending that goes towards financing education is few. Furthermore, most of the students are poor, so access to programs or virtual tools which involve an expense makes it difficult due to economic problems. How a country with that kind of problems can overcome or deal with these problems? Sorry, Dr. Magid, we're trying to answer some of the questions with Shamima and
No,
Alden.
that's great. That's great. I think let's continue with answering the questions. I was just trying to thank all of the panelists, and I wanted to thank all the audience. And maybe if there are more questions that you want to go ahead and address, please go ahead.
would you like to take the question?
Sure. I mean, I think the answer is it's never going to be equitable in the world. I'm sorry, but I mean, that's the case. Not everyone will have equal access, and we have to accept that. So what does that mean? It means that we should look for tools that don't need as much access, lower bandwidth requirements, ability to use more native or to use things that are already innate on whether it's the mobile device or the computer or whatever it may be, right? How do we get around that? How do we do things that are asynchronous, where a student maybe can download materials, work on it, and then upload their submission or whatever that may be? But I think those things all help, but none of them will be perfect. None of them will 100% guarantee equal access. And I don't think we can ever, unfortunately, guarantee 100% equal access across the world. But there are things we can do using technology, using tools to reduce the disparity. At least that's my opinion. I mean, Shamima, you may have different opinions.
No, that's really right, Alden. And what you said is it's impossible to provide 100%, but there's a lot of initiatives that are happening around the world, like open educational resources, the OERs that are available, that MIT OpenCourseWare program, for example, and the MOOCs that are available from many of the universities, which are many of the time free to access or at a very small cost if you want to get a certificate for it. And in fact, those are the programs that are gaining more popularity. Take Coursera or Udemy, for example, which are offering that kind of a certification program, which is what is becoming more accessible, which is what is bridging that gap in terms of those who can afford to go to an university and those who can't, but can still get an education that is future relevant.
Thank you, Samira and Alden, for that. And I would like to take another question. I think while you were talking, Alden, you talked about curiosity. So one of the questions is, I think it's very difficult to create curiosity in all the students because they are all different. How to do this? The teachers need to learn how to do it.
I actually think it's a little bit different. So I agree with you. Creating curiosity is hard. I agree with that. But I'm not sure ultimately, and maybe this is me as a faculty pushing it on someone else, I think a lot of that comes from the system, the society, and the families, right? Show me a 3-year-old who isn't curious, right? I mean, every small child is curious. So it's not that we need to learn curiosity. I think it's actually the reverse. We need to unlearn losing curiosity. And I know that sounds strange, right? But by the time students are in university, much of that is, unfortunately, has been lost for many students, but it's not because the university did something wrong. It's because between the age of 3 or 4 or 5 and, whatever, 18, 19, 20, the student lost that curiosity. And there are societal reasons. There are school-based education reasons why that happens. And, to me, one of the things I think we as adults, I'm presuming most of the audience are adults, I don't know, but we, at least on the panel, are adults. What we can do is demonstrate that there is a benefit of curiosity at any age, whether you're 10, 20, 30, 50, 80, be curious. And other people will see your curiosity, and I hope that it will become something they wonder about, and maybe they will become curious about why you are curious, right? So I think that's an aspect that I would talk about for curiosity, is less about how to teach it, more about how to not lose it.
I really like the answer. Shamima, a question?
Yeah, I don't think we have enough time, if you let me, to talk about curiosity, because that's one of my passionate subjects, right? Like what Alden said, I have this famous saying that is, we are all born curious and then we go to school, right? So that is where we begin to lose it, because like I said, kids ask a lot of questions, but as you go into school, you're told not to ask questions, but just give answers. But now if you look at it, we are actually preparing them for a world for non-Googleable answers, as they call it, which means that they need to ask good questions, which is really where the magic lies, really. And I think that's actually, like what Alden said, it's a part of an education problem, but also a societal problem, because kids don't only learn from school. Actually, 80% of learning that occurs at a young age learns at an informal learning environment. When they go to school, at home, at park, when they're in a kitchen, when they are going to a museum. And that is why it's not just a school's responsibility to build that. It's actually the whole informal learning community that surrounds a community, like museums, art galleries, and parks, and outdoor environments, and a family that builds that kind of a curiosity and to sustain it. And you know what they say, it takes a village to raise a child, and that's exactly true in this kind of a situation. It takes a village to raise and keep a curious child. So it's everyone's responsibility to do that. And I think we can all do that by being self-learners. When a lot of people tell me something and I don't understand it, but I immediately go in and search about it and learn about it. And that's the only way I keep myself updated. And that goes for many of the others as well, who are where they are because of that curiosity. So
I like so much your answers, and I just want to add one more thing related to what Shamima said now. Exactly what's happening with my daughter. So 7 years old, and she's not getting enough from asking me questions, and some questions are really difficult. So whenever I tell her no, what she does immediately is just she opens the iPad and Siri, how does this work? And she's just finding another alternative for me, but at least she really wants to know the answer. So she just goes around asking everyone around her to know the answer. So I'm sure that I really agree with you. I don't think that children need to learn curiosity. They are very curious, but they need to find someone who tells them the answer, or at least tell them search for it, rather than telling them you don't have the right to ask, for example. So something like that.
Yeah, I'd add to that, Hadija, which is beyond just tell her I don't know and she's going to go ask Siri or whatever it may be. I'd actually encourage you as a parent to think about the next step, which is after you find the answer, please come tell me what the answer is, right? Because that not only then encourages her to be curious and to find the answer, but demonstrates to her that you too are curious. And also, of course, over time would educate you about whatever the topic is.
She asks very difficult questions, really.
I want to add one more thing to that, is that when many of the time we stop a question because we don't know the answer. And we are living in an environment where we are not going to know all the answers. That is the truth, because things are changing so fast. So it's not a problem that if you don't know a response to that. So maybe a question at that point is that, why do you think that is? Like a child will come to, why is the sky blue? The question to ask them is, why do you think that is? And in fact, they may already know an answer or what they think is an answer, and that becomes their process in learning and finding out.
Thank you so much, Samia, for that. And I have another question for you, because I think you might know a lot about this part rather than me, at least. And Alden, of course, can give us his insight. So one of the questions says, I've learned over the past year that traditional textbook teaching cannot work with an online school. It's not engaging enough. Gamification work better. So the person here is asking the problem that we have syllabi to complete, and for schools leading up to A levels and O levels, there isn't a lot of flexibility that's possible in the classes leading up to these qualifications. Is there a way to resolve this unless Cambridge changes the requirements, and how? So this is a very tough or difficult question.
So I think the schools will ultimately change those requirements, but it's not going to happen next year. But I do think, as Shamima pointed out, we saw within the last 18 months here a radical shift in the American educational system, basically leaving the SAT test behind. Who, at least when I was a student, who would have thought ever that would disappear? I mean, it never. Sure, they changed some of the content and little small changes, but now many schools have decided that they no longer need or want even those types of standardized examinations. So I do think the exams will change, but that's not changing in the next year, to the questioner's comment. I think the thing we can look at is, yes, universities or A levels, O levels, whatever it may be, are, at least for now, fairly standardized. And using a traditional textbook isn't going to answer that. But the test doesn't necessarily ask you for the traditional textbook. The test doesn't care how you gained the knowledge. So it is the job of the schools, in this case, secondary schools, because we're talking O levels and A levels, and the teachers to adapt the curriculum to teach the same content, unfortunately, in my opinion, because that's what's still required. I personally am not a huge fan of those standardized tests, but I recognize, yes, they are required. And I recognize, yes, they are still an important part of society. And I don't have the power to change that. So I will accept that for now.
So for now, the textbooks are here, but not for in the near future. Many institutions are adapting that model because I think we all know the cost of the textbook kind of a situation that is there. It's highly overpriced and never completed. And so many of the institutions have now begun to use a model in which they go no textbooks, but our teachers will sit together and create the materials that are more relevant. And I agree, standardized tests are going to stay, but there are many ways to be able to teach kids to be able to prepare for those tests, but still be able to build the 21st century skills that is much beyond the test. And even the tests are changing. If you look at some of the tests like the PISA test or the Pearl test, the kind of questions that are being asked and the kind of skills that they're being tested are not the same that was even just 2-3 years back. So the assessment changes are coming, they're coming really fast. And like this, again, there was no examinations the past couple of years in the UK because there was not possible to take the exams. So they did take a combined score. So if that was possible for this year, why not? And which was a very hard year to teach. Why not for the coming year? So the questions are being asked and the answers are not there yet, but they're coming.
Thank you so much, Samia, for that. I think it might be the last question, I hope, if you don't mind to answer this question. So, as you know, one of the biggest challenges in the classroom is improving learner motivation. It is the teacher's responsibility to engage learners in learning by flipping into intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. Some strategies that can be used in the classroom to motivate learners is to develop growth mindset over fixed mindset. My question is, how do we enhance a growth mindset in the classroom? Would any of you love to?
I'll take some of that. First of all, I think it depends on the age of the student and the level of the student, right? So I teach at a business school, which means by definition, people have already not only earned their bachelor's degree in university, but have worked for at least a few years, all right? So the people that I am interacting with typically are late 20s in terms of age, and they tend to be a little bit more mature, all right? They're not a teenager, for example. And I think, therefore, it's very different in my experience because they tend to be not just motivated, they tend to be highly motivated, in part because they're paying tens of thousands of dollars per year to be in that institution. And mostly they're paying it directly from their own pocket. There's not a whole lot of grants being given out or aid being given out. So the students who show up have self-selected, right? They're already fairly motivated before they come in the door, which honestly, as a faculty member, makes it much easier. I mean, it makes it much nicer because they are highly motivated students. So part of it, I guess, is a question of, is it the job of faculty, or should it be the job of faculty to motivate the student, or should the student be self-motivated? And should those students who are not self-motivated, honestly, should they be there? Now, again, I'm talking at a graduate level. This is very different. If you tell me it's a 7-year-old child, I would have a very different answer. So I don't want you to all look at me suddenly like I'm a horrible person because I'm not teaching small children. Now, I understand a 7-year-old doesn't want to necessarily be in school, right? But at a university level or a graduate level, it's a very different form of situation, right? These are people who in general have chosen to be there, and they are motivated to be there on their own. So I don't necessarily think it's the job of the faculty to try and motivate them. I think it is the job of faculty to maintain that motivation and to feed that motivation, but that's different. And I have not taught at the secondary or primary school level, so I honestly can't relate to those students in the same way.
Maybe I will take it from the viewpoint of a K-12 environment, let's say. And yes, I mean, students need to have self-motivation, but a 7-year-old doesn't know what self-motivation is, right? So we really cannot blame them for that. But how do you, in that case, motivate the students? And I think the answer lies partly in having learner agency, as I would call it, which means that there is a control of learning by the students. And I think that gives them a feeling that they are responsible for their learning. And that gives them more a motivation to learn. And I think that is where teachers can personalize and contextualize it and make it relatable. That's when I think students learn better at that age. Yeah. And like I said initially, students at all ages don't want to be taught, they want to learn. So I think if we don't come with the perspective of, I'm here to teach you, but I'm here to help us all learn together, and if the teachers are able to communicate at that level, and I think that's what builds the interest and the motivation and the bond for the students. And that sometimes sets the whole trend of how the students view learning in a lifetime, for a lifetime.
Amazing answers from both of you, of course. I really loved learning from you today. I learned a lot, and I learned also how to answer my daughter's questions. So thank you so much for your time, Alden and Shamima. And the last thing I would say to the audience is thank you all for your time today. We really enjoyed having you, and wait for us in other webinars, in the next webinars. And one last thing, it's a gift from us, from Braksylabs. All of you will be receiving a code for a discount, 30% discount for yourselves or your universities. If you would love to be with us, if you would love to be benefiting from the virtual labs for yourself as a student, a professor, or of course a university or a Ministry of Education, like we're trying now to work with ministries of education around the world to help benefit more students. So thank you everyone, and we'll be emailing you the webinar recording and the code as well. Thank you, Shamima and Alden, again, and enjoy talking to you. Have a nice day.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it.
Really enjoyed it. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.